Hello, it's me, Larry, and thank you for clicking on this video. Welcome to the Literary Gladiators channel. I This is the final Monday in Lent, which means it's Holy Monday, which means it's Holy Week, and it also means that I am discussing a short story by Flannery O'Connor. This week I'm going to be going over The Displaced Person, which is from her collection, A Good Man Is Hard to Find. It is the last story in that collection. And it's a rather long short story, but it's definitely one that I believe is worth looking at. So I'm going to go ahead and give you a brief summary here. This is a story about a farm owner in the Deep South in the 1940s by the name of Mrs. McIntyre. She has some help on the farm. She has Mr. Shortley and his wife. Mr. Shortley runs the dairy farm for her. And then she has a couple of black hands that do some work for her as well, by the name of Astor, who's an old man who's been there from the very beginning, and the other one is named Sulk. Now, she finds out that because World War II has just ended, that, in news of the horrors that Hitler was doing over in Europe and Poland especially, and in Germany, but mostly in Poland, the concentration camps and all of that, she recognizes an opportunity to bring on some additional help. So she finds a Catholic priest who is able to send for a Polish family that had been displaced by the war. The Polish family's name is the Goysacks. They come over to work on the farm. The man does, especially. He's doing the work on the farm. And things kind of go downhill from there. So what is this? What are the themes here that we're dealing with in this story? I believe that there are two major themes. The first one are sins of speech. We're going to be talking about sins of speech a little bit. They are things that you say that cause damage to other people. And the wife of Mr. Shortley, Mrs. Shortley, is guilty of that sin. Then the other idea that I think this story is really kind of honing in on here, I'm going to read you a passage from the Bible. This is from the Gospel according to Matthew. It goes like this. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, he will sit upon his glorious throne, and all the nations will be assembled before him. And he will separate them one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will place the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. A stranger, and you welcomed me. Naked, and you clothed me. Ill, and you cared for me. In prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous will answer him and say, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? When did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? When did we see you ill or in prison and visit you?" And the king will say to them in reply, "Amen, I say to you, whatever you did for one of these least brothers of mine, you did for me." Then he will say to those on his left, "Depart from me, you accursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. A stranger, and you gave me no welcome. Naked, and you gave me no clothing. Ill, and in prison, and you did not care for me." Then they will answer and say, "Lord, when did we see you hungry, or thirsty, or a stranger, or naked, or ill, or in prison, and not minister to your needs? He will answer them, Amen, I say to you, when you did not do for one of these least ones, you did not do for me. And these will go off to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life. So there we have the idea that the way that you treat the least fortunate person is the way that you treat Christ himself. And this is a major theme within this work. So those are the two major themes that I find. And again, those are the sins of speech. Specifically, we're talking about detraction and talebearing. Those are the two sins of speech that we are going to be talking about in relation to this story. And then that idea of the least fortunate being Christ-like. So, let's begin. So the story opens with the Polish family, the Goysacks, arriving on Mrs. McIntyre's farm. Mrs. Shortley is introduced to them right away, and she automatically does not like them. Now, the Goysacks are homeless. They come from a place where they had been kicked out of their home due to the war. They spent time in a camp, and they are now going to be living on a farm in a strange country where they don't speak English, and they have no family, no friends, no connections. So, when we talk about the different people in this story, Mrs. McIntyre, she owns the farm. Then you have the Shortleys, who are a white family, and then you have the two blacks. And beneath all of these are the Polish family, because they have absolutely no advantage. They are completely at the mercy of Mrs. McIntyre and their neighbors on this farm. So when we look at the idea of the least of Christ's brothers being treated as Christ himself, that's definitely going to be the Goysacks for the purposes of this narrative. Now, when I talk about the sins of detraction, Mrs. Shortley, takes an immediate dislike to these people. She sees them as foreign. She sees their religion as unreformed and primitive. She sees them, because they are Catholic, she sees them as beneath her. And she had seen a newsreel after the war, immediately after the war, I guess, it was a newsreel that showed footage of, the horrors of Auschwitz and these prison camps. And she associates the family with that and thinks, even though, they were victims of that, that there's just something about the fact that they come from that place, they're bringing that over, all that murder and horror. So that's the way that she looks at them right off the bat. And so she starts to sin against them. She starts to immediately talk bad about them to the two black men on the farm, Astor and Sulk. She starts to, say, you better watch out, because there's a million billion of these people, she says, that are going to be coming over and taking the jobs away from you black people. And that is the very beginning. And then she starts to see herself as an angel, warning all the black people about, how all these displaced Europeans are going to be coming over and this thing. So this is a sin of talebearing, which is where, you're kind of trying to hurt the relationship between different people, right? So, these two, they're all going to be neighbors, they're all going to be living on the same farm together. There's no reason why they shouldn't be able to get along. But right off the bat, this woman is talking negatively about this family that just arrived and trying to kind of turn people against them. So this is it's a sin. And sins of speech are, they're particularly dangerous, especially the two that we're dealing with here, which is detraction and talebearing, because of the fact that there's no real way to make restitution. Once you say something about somebody and damage their reputation in a way, that you're setting somebody's mind to be against them in a way that you really can't do anything about after it's done, right? You can apologize and say, oh, I was wrong for doing that and all that, but, in a lot of sense, the damage is already done. So it's a dangerous thing to engage in that kind of behavior. Now, what happens is, okay, the the idea of this the idea of this Polish man being Christ-like. So Mr. Goysak is really good at working. He does an immaculate job. Everything that he does is really pleasing to Mrs. McIntyre. She thinks he's amazing, and she's not shy about telling Mrs. Shortley about how great she thinks he is. So in the meanwhile, okay, we come to find out that the Shortleys are running an illegal still on the property. Okay, this is Mrs. McIntyre's property. They are paid to work for her and not to operate a still, right? They're not supposed to be making alcohol. And Mrs. Shortley becomes very concerned that Mr. Goysak is going to find out about this still and tell Mrs. McIntosh about it. And Mrs. McIntyre. And the reason that she is afraid of that, or one of the reasons, is another incident that happens whereby young Sulk is stealing a turkey from Mrs. McIntyre, gets caught by Mr. Goysak, who tackles him and takes him and puts him down in front of Mrs. McIntyre. And Mrs. McIntyre is told about what happened, and Sulk denies that he was stealing the turkey, and she tells him put the turkey back, and then she has Mr. Goysak's little boy come out so that she can have him translate that that's just how black people are, she tells him. And he's very kind of disappointed to hear this. And the reason is because we start to understand that Mrs. McIntyre views Mr. Goysak as, and everybody really on the farm, as disposable. So we find out that one of the reasons that she brought these people into her farm in the first place was to scare everybody, right? Like into working harder for her, because she feels that with the Goysaks there, they're people that really need the work, so they're going to obviously do the best job that they can, and this will scare everybody else into doing better work. So not a very good or Christian way to look at people, right? It's very exploitative, and that is probably Mrs. McIntyre's sin in all this, is that she commodifies people in that way. So Mrs. Shortley, because of the fact that she is kind of resentful of the fact that Mrs. McIntyre is always using Mr. Goysak to, in a roundabout way, put down her husband, and also because she is afraid that Mr. Goysak is going to find out about this still that they have, starts to talk to Mrs. McIntyre and try to poison her against him. Okay, she says things like, she says things like, oh, Mr. Goysak speaks perfect English probably, but the only reason that he doesn't speak English is so that he can just go on doing things the way that he wants to do them. She says that she heard from her daughter, who heard it from the Goysak daughter, that they are going to buy a car once they get enough money, but that they're not being paid enough. The Goysaks feel like they're not being paid enough, right? So this is detraction. This is where the kind of the sin of gossip, right? Where you're talking about people, telling tales out of school, and you're doing so in a way to hurt them, right? To hurt their standing, to hurt their good name. But this one kind of backfires, because when Mrs. McIntyre hears about this, she says, well, I can't afford to pay them any more than what I'm paying them. So then she calls in the priest to talk to the priest about it. And, the priest kind of makes her see that, because of the fact that the Goysaks are so hard up, that, if you can't afford to pay everybody, then you'd have to let somebody else go. And who does she decide to let go? But the Shortleys. She's makes that decision, and Mrs. Shortley overhears this. So before she could even have an opportunity to to get fired, or to have her husband get fired, they pack up the car and they go. And she is so upset by what happened that she has a stroke right there in the car and dies. Now, Mrs. McIntyre doesn't know that Mrs. Shortley died, so she's pleased as punch because she has now this great worker that's so much better than Mr. Shortley and will be able to do, all the work that he does, plus some more, plus all that he's already doing. And she didn't even have to fire Mr. Shortley. And then they started, the story lets us know that there have been many different families that had worked for them, and she never had to fire any of them. They just left on their own accord, and how happy she was about that, because it was like, she was able to avoid that confrontation. But the other thing that we learn about that is, again, the commodification of people, right? Like, we find out that she has had, so many different families, and that had been on the farm with her since her first husband died, and that they were all, none of them stayed as long as the Shortleys, and the Shortleys had only stayed for 2 years. So, she's always becoming dissatisfied with people. And one of the things that she was dissatisfied with about Mr. Shortley, again, she never found out about the still as far as we know, but the fact that he smoked in the barn when he was milking the cows. All right, now, this is a long time ago, but before smoking became as taboo as it is now. So to think about something like that, right, where she's making a big deal about the fact that he smoked, and Mr. Goysack doesn't smoke, but your husband smokes, she would say to Mrs. Shortley and things like that. So, very much like puritanical she's described as in one point in the story. And you definitely see that, right? Like, as soon as she finds out one thing that you do that she doesn't approve of, you're on her list. It's only a matter of time before you're going to get the boot, it seems like. Excuse me. We also see this in another way, too, that she has had 3 husbands. Right? Like, the first husband she married when she was 30 and he was in his 70s. And he was rich, so that's why she married him. And she looks at it as she wouldn't even want to admit to herself that she liked him, because of the fact that she looked at this marriage as, again, just a way to earn a living. In fact, it was the judge was her husband, and this is the farm that she had acquired through his death. So one thing I should mention also is that there are peacocks on this farm. There's about 20 peacocks, we find out, when Mrs. McIntyre was married to the judge, who was her original husband. And then as she got married in subsequent times, the number of peacocks became fewer and fewer. In the opening scene of the story, when the priest first arrives on the farm, he sees the last remaining peacock. And he says to Mrs. McIntyre, that's a beautiful bird. And she basically says to him that, she's been letting them die out because she can't stand to hear them at night. So what I think these peacocks represent is the state of Mrs. McIntyre's soul, right? When she was first married, she had 20 peacocks. And then as she kind of got into the habit of treating her husbands as disposable items, there's been fewer and fewer peacocks on the farm, to the point now where there's only one peacock and a couple of hens, and she can't stand to hear them at night. And I think that is because that is when her conscience is bothering her, and we'll see that there's a dream toward the end where she doesn't quite know how to handle what she's dreaming. Now, the next thing that happens in this story is that Mr. Goysack hands the young black man named Sulk a photograph. And Mrs. McIntyre sees this, and she is suspicious, because originally it was Mrs. Shortley, but then also the older black man, Astor, was telling her about how, there's something up with this guy that you don't know. Now, the gossip had gotten all around to everybody except to her. But she wants to find out what's going on. So she goes over to Sulk and she asks him, what is that? And he says, oh, it's nothing. He hands it to her. She looks at it, and it turns out it's a picture of a young white girl who is Mr. Goysak's cousin, who he has told Sulk that if Sulk can pay for half of what it costs to get her over from Poland, then he'd be able to marry her. Now, of course, this being the 1940s in the South, this idea is appalling to Mrs. McIntyre. So pretty much she decides right then and there that Mr. Goysak is not her kind of people after all. So she goes and talks to him, and she's really mad at first, and she lays it out. She says, look, this kind of thing is unacceptable, can't happen. This is my place, and I won't allow it, and it's wrong, and all this, and she gets it all out, and then she sees that Mr. Goysak is trying to work out what she's saying to him, because he doesn't speak English, and then she remembers what Mrs. Shortley had said to her about how he only pretends to not understand, so then he can just go on doing his own thing. And then she gets all mad again, and pretty much that seals Mr. Goysak's fate in a way. And again, we see that even though Mrs. Shortley, she's not even alive anymore, but still those words that she used to hurt Mr. Goysak are alive and well and doing damage even now, like ripples from when you drop a rock in the water, it ripples out, and you see these. This is how the ripple is affecting things. So Mrs. McIntyre has the priest come by the farm so that she can talk to him about the possibility of letting Mr. Goysak go. When she brings it up to him, he explains to her that she does not have a legal responsibility to keep the Goysaks on her farm, but she does have a moral one. And I believe that what he's referring to is the passages that we referred to earlier in this video, where I read to you from the Gospel according to Matthew about everything related to how you treat the least of my brothers is how you treat me. So Mrs. Goysak is now sitting there angrily thinking about how she doesn't believe she has this moral requirement to keep the Goysaks, while the priest is talking to her about doctrine of the church. She's getting madder and madder, and finally she interrupts him and says that she has to talk to him about something practical. So I'm going to read to you what she says to the priest and what happens immediately after that. And this is where you really start to see how Mr. Goysak is taking on a Christ-like persona in this story. I tell you, if I had a white man who understood the Negroes, I'd have let Mr. Goysak go, she said, and stood up again. He turned then and looked her in the face. He has nowhere to go, he said. Then he said, Dear lady, I know you well enough to know you wouldn't turn him out for a trifle. And without waiting for an answer, he raised his hand and gave her his blessing in a rumbling voice. She smiled angrily and said, I didn't create this situation, of course. The priest let his eyes wander toward the birds. They had reached the middle of the lawn. The cock stopped suddenly, and curving his neck backwards, he raised his tail and spread it with a shimmering, timbrous noise. Tiers of small, pregnant suns floated in a green-gold haze over his head. The priest stood transfixed, his jaw slack. Mrs. McIntyre wondered where she had ever seen such an idiotic old man. Christ will come like that, he said in a loud, gay voice, and wiped his hand over his mouth and stood there gaping. Mrs. McIntyre's face assumed a set, puritanical expression, and she reddened. Christ in the conversation embarrassed her the way sex did her mother. It is not my responsibility that Mr. Goysak has nowhere to go, she said. I don't find myself responsible for all the extra people in the world. That's another thing, is that she describes all the people that she doesn't want to have anything to do with as extra, intimating overpopulation, right? Which is a common theme that we hear from people today, from the secular world today. The old man didn't seem to hear her. His attention was fixed on the cock, who was taking minute steps backwards, his head against the spread tail. The Transfiguration, he murmured. She had no idea what he was talking about. Mr. Goysak didn't have to come here in the first place, she said, giving him a hard look. The cock lowered his tail and began to peck grass. He didn't have to come in the first place, she repeated, emphasizing each word. The old man smiled absently. He came to redeem us, he said, and blandly reached for her hand and shook it and said he must go. So, now what's happening there, right? Especially at that last part. She's talking about Mr. Goysak, but the priest assumes that she's talking about Jesus Christ because of this this experience that he just had watching the peacock spread out its feathers. He says it's like the Transfiguration. Now, the Transfiguration is a story in the gospel where Jesus takes on his glorified body. Okay, so this is before the crucifixion. He takes three of the apostles. He takes Peter, James, and John up to a mountain, and then all of a sudden his face starts to glow. His clothes turn white, and he is a vision to them that they can't, that they can barely stand to behold because of the fact that he is glorified. And now, in that passage that I read at the beginning of the story, if you remember, it starts out that the Son of Man will come in all his glory, right? So this is what the thoughts that are going through the priest's mind, and this is just after he just got done saying that he's got nowhere else to go. Mr. Goysak's got nowhere else to go. Then the peacock spreads his tail, and the priest beholds it and says, that's how Christ will come. So in one sense, he's talking about Mr. Goysak having no place to go in the world, just as Jesus is describing the least of his brothers in the book of Matthew. Now, the priest says he came to redeem us, speaking of Christ, but she was speaking of Mr. Goysak, and in a way, both are true. Because Mr. Goysak is the least of Christ's brothers in this story. He came to give Mrs. McIntyre a chance to treat him the way that you ought to treat Christ, and to so offer grace and redemption to her. So, we have this kind of intermingling, and it becomes a little bit more and more as the story goes on. We see this continue, particularly when she's dialoguing with the priest. Whether they're talking about Mr. Goysak or Christ becomes a little less clear all the time. It's all very, very clever what Flannery O'Connor is doing in this story, I believe. So now Mr. Shortley comes back and explains to Mrs. McIntyre that Mrs. Shortley died of a stroke. And of course, we saw that what happened was that Mrs. Shortley was filling Mrs. McIntyre's head up with ideas about the Goysacks leaving her back when Mrs. McIntyre was in favor of the Goysacks. So she felt the need to let them go. But now when Mr. Shortley returns, who does he blame for his wife's death? He blames Mr. Goysack. So what we see here is a kind of scapegoating happening, whereby the sins of the community around them are being put onto Mr. Goysack. And this is a kind of an idea that this made me think of, was the idea of Christ the Lamb. Because another thing too, that Mr. Goysack, when he comes back, he sees that there's a change in Mrs. McIntyre, and the change is that her conscience is starting to bother her in a way. And he's afraid that she's going to start going to Mass. With the priest is going to get her to go to Mass. And he sees this as a potential problem, obviously. And the interesting thing here, right, is that we get this juxtaposition of the scapegoating, okay, in which you try to absolve yourself of responsibility for sin in this world, and by putting it on somebody else, our sins or whatever, right? Maybe we judge people very harshly because we don't want to look at ourselves in the mirror and say what we're doing wrong. So we start judging other people very harshly. We see that this is something that Mrs. McIntyre is struggling with, right? Because again, she looks at people as very disposable and commodifies them to the point where she's willing to kick people off her farm for nothing more than having a cigarette in her barn, right? So very harsh kind of an outlook. Again, Mr. Goysack's big crime here is that he is trying to get his cousin, who is 16 years old and all by herself with no place to go and no place to live, right? He's trying to raise money to bring her over there, and actually has the audacity to think that she could marry a black person. So Mrs. McIntyre looks at that as totally appalling, but she doesn't look at anything in her own life as such, right? So when we go to Mass as Catholics, what we are doing is we are actually participating in the sacrifice of Christ. And we are doing it with Christ the Lamb, who is by which Christ redeemed the world, is through that sacrifice. So we get to participate in that. And by participating in that, we are admitting that it is a necessary sacrifice, and it is necessary because of our own sins. So, who offers up Christ to the sacrifice? And the answer is the whole congregation does. Everybody has to do that. We have to offer Christ up as the sacrificial lamb, because he is spotless, and we are responsible for the evil in the world. Mrs. McIntyre, it sees this as the opposite, right? So instead of sacrificing Christ the Lamb, what ends up happening is she ends up being complicit in the murder of Mr. Goysack as judge, okay? So when Christ came the first time, he came as a lamb. When he comes the second time, he's coming as a lion. And what that means is that he's going to judge the nations on his return. We saw that in the passage that I read in the beginning. Well, if you're offering Christ, as a sacrifice in order to take responsibility for the evil in the world, that is the Christian perspective. But if you are instead killing Christ as the judge so that you don't have to take responsibility for your own actions, then that is what we see happening in this story. That's what we see Mrs. McIntyre doing, and it's what we see Mrs. Shortley doing in the beginning, when it is the fact that she and Mr. Shortley are running a still that she sees Mr. Goysack and wants him gone because she's afraid that he's going to turn them in. So now what happens is, in the story, Mr. Shortley comes back. He starts, she promises him that he can have his job back, but first she wants to get things straight with the priest and explain to him why nothing involving Mr. Goysack is her responsibility, either morally or legally. And so she says to Mr. Shortley that she's going to let him go, give him a 30 days notice once the new month starts, but the priest doesn't come around, so she doesn't get a chance to. And, time goes by. to the point where she ends up not being able to let him go, but ends up being complicit in the man's murder. What happens is that she goes to finally fire him out the night after she has this dream in which she is arguing with the priest. And the priest is basically saying to her that she needs to look after Mr. Goysak and to keep him on because of the fact that she has to think about, everything that they went through over in Poland, and that she has to do it for Christ. And she's rejecting this idea in her dream, and the dream bothers her so much that when she gets up, she decides, okay, that's it. I'm going to have to go and let him go. But she hasn't been able to find the gumption to do that yet. So she goes down, and she sees that Mr. Goysak is underneath the tractor replacing a part. Sulk is there helping him, while Mr. Shortly is getting on the other tractor to go and do some work. So he gets the tractor started. He puts it on a slight incline and puts the brake on, gets off the tractor, and the brake slips and the tractor starts coming toward Mr. Goysak, who doesn't know. So in this story, we have Mrs. Shortley, who is causing a lot of problems by detracting. Okay, so the things that she is saying is causing Mr. Goysak's reputation to be damaged. Then we have Mrs. McIntyre, who is doing the same, right? In her speech, she's talking about how all these people are just extra people in the world, and that they don't really matter. Then Mr. Shortley, when he returns, he's doing the same thing. He's talking about how he's being, as a veteran, he's not being considered because Mr. Goysak is kind of taking his place. Even though Mr. Goysak is a far better worker, he's more industrious, he's a better worker. Not only is he more industrious, but he's more capable at everything. So but he doesn't look at it that way. He looks at it as he's a man who deserves everything that he gets because of the fact that he fought in the war and everything. So and then he's going around town telling everybody about how Mrs. McIntyre is mistreating him. So again, right, we have all these sins of speech. And now, with the tractor coming toward Mr. Goysak, who doesn't see it because he's underneath the tractor, everybody has an opportunity to use their speech to save him and to get him out of the way. But what happens is nobody says anything. They just let the tractor go and run him over. So the story says that Mrs. McIntyre had a nervous breakdown shortly after all of her help left. The two black men left, Mr. Shortley left, and she is left alone on the farm. She can't care for the dairy farm anymore. She has to sell off the cows. Nobody comes to visit her except for the priest, who on his way to visit her will always feed that peacock, right? And I look at that as he's feeding her soul and trying to nurse her back to spiritual health. And that's how the story ends. So she's got a shot at, as we all do every day, we all have a chance to repent, and the priest is trying to help her to do that. So that's how the story ends. And I think it's a really good story. Really gets at some good, deep theological questions. Really made me think about this idea of the scapegoat versus the lamb. The lion. Are you going to murder the lion, or are you going to sacrifice the lamb, and how and what that means in the two different contexts of who Christ is. So, thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that you will continue to watch videos on this channel. Please subscribe to this channel and like this video if you would. Leave a comment below. I'm going to keep talking about Flannery O'Connor stories, at least for some time. So I hope everybody has a wonderful Holy Week. This is a great time to think. I'm going to put a video in the description. It's Father Gregory Pine, who is a Dominican friar, and he's going to talk about the sins of speech that I have mentioned here. He's going to give a more full description of them, what they are, what they mean according to Thomistic theology. And when we talk about Thomistic theology, we're talking about St. Thomas of Aquinas, and he is, one of the great Christian philosophers, in history. In fact, he is the doctor of the church. He's known as, which, and his theology was very important to Flannery O'Connor. She called herself a hillbilly Thomist because she loved his philosophy so much. So you can take a look at that, and maybe that'll give you something to think about as we prepare for Easter. So thank you everybody for watching, and keep reading.